The realtor's hand was still resting on my arm when the couple from the Hendricksons' old house stepped through the front door, took one look at the two of us standing in that sunlit kitchen, and said, without a shred of doubt in their voice, "Oh, you two make this place feel like a home already." Before I could open my mouth to correct them, before the words, "She's not my wife," could even form on my tongue, she turned to them, and with a soft, knowing smile that I would think about for the rest of my life, she said, "Not yet." 2 words. That was all it took to crack something open in my chest that had been sealed shut for 3 years, something I didn't even know was still capable of feeling anything at all. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and until that Saturday afternoon in early spring, I had convinced myself that I was simply a man looking for a smaller house. That was the story I told everyone, including myself. I told my sister that the old place on Maple Ridge was too big for one person, too full of echoes, too expensive to heat in the winter for someone who only used 2 of its 4 bedrooms. I told my co-workers I wanted something with less yard work, something closer to town. I told the real estate agent I hired, a woman named Claire Bennett, that I was simply downsizing. None of that was true, not really. The truth was that I could not spend one more Christmas morning walking past a room that still had my wife's reading glasses folded on the nightstand, could not stand one more spring watching the garden she planted come back to life while she never would. The truth was that grief had made a stranger of me in my own home, and I was running, dressed up in the practical language of square footage and property taxes, but running all the same. If you've ever lost someone you built a life with, if you know what it means to walk through your own house like a ghost haunting the rooms where you used to be happy, then maybe you already understand why I'm telling you this story. And if kindness and second chances mean anything to you at all, I'd ask you to hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you're here, share this with someone who might need it today, and subscribe to this channel, because what happened to me over the following months is the kind of thing I never believed could happen to a man like me again. I never believed the ache could soften. I never believed a stranger's small kindness could crack open a door I thought had been welded shut forever. But it did, and I want you to walk through that door with me. Claire Bennett had been recommended to me by a man at my office whose daughter had used her to buy her first condo. She specialized, he told me, in helping people find homes that fit not just their budget but their life, whatever that meant. I nearly laughed when he said it. My life, at the time, fit into a single overstuffed recliner and a television I left on for the noise more than the content. But I called her anyway, because doing something, anything, felt slightly better than doing nothing, and because my sister Meredith had started leaving worried voicemails about how long I'd been, just existing, in that house. The first time I met Claire, she was standing outside a modest brick colonial with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a coffee in the other hand, and she greeted me not with the practiced enthusiasm of a salesperson but with something quieter, more attentive. She asked me what I was looking for, and when I gave her the rehearsed answer about square footage and low-maintenance yards, she looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that tells you someone has heard 100 rehearsed answers before and knows exactly what they're covering up, and she said simply, "Okay. Let's start there, and we'll see what we find." Over the following weeks, we walked through more houses than I could count. Ranch homes with too much carpet, split levels with staircases that made my knees ache just looking at them, a few condos that felt more like hotel rooms than places a person could build a life. Claire never rushed me. She would stand back in doorways and let me linger in kitchens, watching my face rather than her clipboard, and more than once I caught her studying me the way you'd study a puzzle you were slowly starting to understand. It was on the 4th week, in the driveway of a house that didn't end up working out, that she asked me the question nobody else had dared to ask directly. She asked if I was looking for a house to fill an absence or a house to build a future in, and whether I knew, myself, which one I was actually doing. I remember the cold spring wind on my face and the strange relief of being asked something honest instead of something polite. I told her about Anna. I told her about the 22 years we'd had, about the ovarian cancer that took 11 brutal months to steal her from me, about the way I still sometimes woke up reaching for a side of the bed that had been empty for 3 years. I told her things I hadn't told my own sister, standing in a stranger's driveway, because something about the way Claire listened made it feel safe to be unguarded. She didn't try to fix me. She didn't offer platitudes about time healing all wounds or Anna being in a better place. She simply nodded and said that grief doesn't leave a house because a person moves, it just repacks its bags and comes along, and the real question was whether I wanted a house that helped carry that weight with me or one that let me pretend the weight wasn't there. I didn't have an answer for her that day. But something about the honesty of the question stayed lodged in my chest for weeks afterward. We kept looking. Slowly, something shifted between us, so gradually I almost didn't notice it happening. Our conversations in the car between showings stopped being strictly business. She told me about her own life in pieces, about a marriage that had ended 8 years earlier, not through tragedy but through the slow erosion of two people who had simply stopped choosing each other, about a teenage son named Ethan she was raising largely on her own, about the way she'd built her career from nothing after the divorce because she needed something that was entirely hers. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught me off guard, the kind of humor that snuck up on you and made you laugh before you realized you hadn't laughed like that in years. I started looking forward to our appointments in a way that had nothing to do with houses. I told myself it was simply nice to have someone to talk to, someone who didn't look at me with the careful, pitying eyes that everyone else in my life had adopted since Anna died. My sister worried about me constantly, but her worry had its own weight to carry. My co-workers were kind but distant, unsure how to talk to a widower, treating grief like a contagious illness best handled from a safe conversational distance. Claire simply treated me like a person. It had been so long since anyone had done that, that I mistook the relief of it for something smaller than it actually was. The open house that changed everything happened on a bright Saturday in April, at a charming craftsman-style home on Birchwood Lane with a wraparound porch and hardwood floors that gleamed even under the dust of vacancy. Claire had told me on the drive over that she had a good feeling about this one, that something about the layout, the light in the kitchen, the quiet street, felt right for me in a way the others hadn't. I remember walking through the front door and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could say, a small flicker of something that wasn't quite happiness but was adjacent to it, a kind of possibility. We were standing in the kitchen, Claire pointing out the original tile backsplash and the way the afternoon sun fell across the counters, when the front door opened and a middle-aged couple walked in, the kind of enthusiastic house hunters who show up early to every open house with a thermos of coffee and a list of questions. They introduced themselves as the Hendricksons, explained they'd sold their own home down the street and were looking to downsize into something smaller, and before either Claire or I could clarify anything, the wife glanced between the two of us, standing close together in that warm kitchen light, and made the assumption that would crack my chest wide open. She said we made the place feel like a home already, the way we stood in the kitchen together, easy and comfortable, like people who belonged in a space together. I felt the words hit me somewhere just beneath my ribs, not with offense but with a strange, disorienting ache, because for one unguarded second, some part of me that I hadn't given permission to speak had wanted it to be true. I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain that Claire was my realtor, not my wife, that this was a professional relationship and nothing more, that I was a widower simply trying to find a smaller house to live out the rest of his quiet, diminished life in. But before I could say any of it, Claire smiled, that same soft, knowing smile, and said only 2 words. Not yet. The Hendricksons laughed, assuming it was a playful joke between a couple still working out the details, still teasing each other about timelines and commitments, and they moved on to ask about the basement and the roof, and the moment passed for them as quickly as it had come. But it didn't pass for me. I stood there in that kitchen with the afternoon light falling across the floor, feeling something in my chest crack open like ice breaking on a pond in early spring, sudden and startling and impossible to undo. I didn't say anything for the rest of the showing. Claire, for her part, didn't bring it up either, though I caught her glancing at me once or twice with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between amusement and uncertainty. It wasn't until we were back in her car, pulling out of the driveway, that I finally asked her why she'd said what she said instead of simply correcting them the way any professional would have. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, before she admitted that she genuinely didn't know why she'd said it, that the words had come out before she'd had time to think them through, and that she'd been turning the moment over in her own mind for the last 20 minutes trying to understand it herself. She said that maybe some part of her simply hadn't wanted to correct them, and that admission hung in the car between us, heavier than either of us seemed prepared for. I want to tell you that from that moment forward, everything unfolded easily, that we fell into a simple, uncomplicated love story the way they do in movies. But that isn't how grief works, and it isn't how real second chances work either. What actually happened was that I panicked. I panicked in the particular, specific way that people who have lost someone panic when they feel the first genuine pull toward happiness again, because happiness feels like betrayal when you've spent years believing your capacity for it died along with the person you loved. For the next 2 weeks, I avoided Claire's calls. I told myself I was simply busy with work, that I needed time to think about the Birchwood Lane house, that there was no reason to read anything into a stray comment from strangers who didn't know either of us. But the truth I could barely admit to myself in the dark hours of those nights, was that I was terrified. Terrified that if I let myself feel something for her, I would be erasing Anna, packing her into some dusty corner of my memory the way people pack away a house they're preparing to sell. Terrified that 22 years of marriage could be reduced to something you simply moved on from, like a lease you'd let expire. I spent those 2 weeks in the old house on Maple Ridge, walking through rooms that felt heavier than ever, sitting in Anna's reading chair by the window where she used to spend her evenings, holding one of her old cardigans that I still hadn't been able to bring myself to donate. I talked to her, the way I still sometimes did in quiet moments, telling her about the strange thing that had happened at the open house, asking her, absurdly, foolishly, what she thought I should do. Of course, there was no answer. There never was. But something about giving voice to the question, out loud, in the silence of that house, made me confront how much I actually wanted there to be an answer that gave me permission to feel something again. It was my sister Meredith who finally broke through the wall I'd built. She came over one evening with takeout containers she didn't ask permission to bring, the way she'd started doing more frequently since Anna died, and she sat with me at the kitchen table and asked, point blank, what was going on, because I hadn't called her back in over a week and that wasn't like me. I don't know what made me tell her the truth that night, maybe exhaustion, maybe the particular safety of being with someone who had known Anna and me both, who had watched our marriage from the outside for 2 decades and loved us both fiercely. But I told her everything, the open house, the 2 words, the 2 weeks of avoiding Claire's calls, the guilt sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. Meredith listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand, the way she used to when we were kids and I'd come to her crying about some schoolyard injustice. She told me something that I have carried with me every day since, something I think about constantly, something I want every one of you watching this to hear clearly if you are carrying grief of your own tonight. She said that loving someone new does not erase the love you had before. She said that Anna would not want me punishing myself for the rest of my life as some kind of penance for surviving her. She said that the version of me who loved Anna for 22 years does not disappear just because another version of me learns to love again, that both can be true at the same time, that grief and joy are not enemies fighting for the same small space in a person's chest, they are simply 2 rooms in the same house, and a person is allowed to walk between them. I sat with that for a long time after she left. I don't think I slept much that night, but for the first time in 3 years, the silence in that house didn't feel quite so unbearable. The next morning, I called Claire. I don't know exactly what I planned to say when she picked up, whether I intended to apologize for going silent or to finally admit what I'd been feeling since that afternoon in the kitchen on Birchwood Lane. What actually happened was that the moment I heard her voice, something in me simply let go of the careful script I'd been rehearsing, and I told her, plainly, that I was sorry for disappearing, that I had been scared, that the comment the Hendricksons made had unlocked something I hadn't expected to feel again and I hadn't known what to do with it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I worried I'd said too much, revealed too much, made the kind of mistake that ends things before they've even had a chance to begin. But then she said, quietly, that she'd been feeling something similar, that she'd spent those same 2 weeks telling herself it was foolish to feel anything toward a client, that it wasn't professional, that she had her own reasons to be cautious after her divorce, but that his silence had made her realize how much she'd been hoping he would call. We met that afternoon, not for a showing, but simply for coffee, the first time either of us had acknowledged out loud that whatever was happening between us existed outside the boundaries of buyer and agent. I remember sitting across from her in a small cafe near the edge of town, the late afternoon light slanting through the windows, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the particular, terrifying vulnerability of caring about someone's answer to a question before you've even asked it. I told her more about Anna that afternoon, about the early years of our marriage when we had nothing but a cramped apartment and enormous plans, about the miscarriage we went through in our 30s that we never fully talked about with anyone else, about the diagnosis that came out of nowhere on an ordinary Tuesday and the 11 months that followed, months I still sometimes relived in nightmares. Claire listened the way she always listened, without trying to fix anything, without offering the kind of easy comfort that skips over the real weight of pain. And when I was finished, she told me about her own losses too, different in shape but real in their own way, the slow death of a marriage that no one mourned properly because it hadn't ended in tragedy, just quiet failure, the particular loneliness of raising a teenage son who was pulling away exactly when she needed connection most, the fear that she had built her entire identity around being useful to other people, a good mother, a good agent, a good ex-wife, and had lost track of who she was. Underneath all that usefulness, we didn't solve anything that afternoon. We didn't make any grand declarations. But something had shifted, some barrier had come down, and for the first time since Anna died, I walked out of a conversation feeling lighter instead of heavier. Over the following months, our relationship deepened slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach something you were terrified of breaking. Claire introduced me to her son Ethan, a quiet, watchful 16-year-old who regarded me with the wary suspicion any teenage boy would have toward a strange man appearing in his mother's life, and I understood that suspicion completely, respected it even, and made no attempt to rush past it. I didn't try to be his friend or his father figure. I simply showed up, consistently, quietly, offering to help him with his car when it broke down on the side of the road one evening, showing genuine interest in the video games he played without pretending to understand them better than I did, and slowly, over weeks, the suspicion in his eyes softened into something like cautious acceptance. I told my sister about Claire properly, this time, not as a confused confession over takeout but as something real I wanted her to know about, and Meredith, who had loved Anna like a sister of her own, surprised me by crying happy tears at the kitchen table, telling me it was the best news she'd heard in 3 years, that Anna would have liked Claire, that Anna would have wanted exactly this for me. But grief, as anyone who has truly lived through it knows, doesn't disappear just because joy starts creeping back into your life. There were nights that summer when the guilt returned in full force, when I would lie awake next to the empty side of the bed and feel like a traitor for the happiness blooming quietly in my chest. There was a particularly hard evening in July, the anniversary of the day Anna was diagnosed, when I found myself unable to answer Claire's texts, unable to explain why the date mattered so much, retreating instead into the old house on Maple Ridge and sitting alone in the dark, drowning in a grief so total it felt like the 3 years since Anna's death had simply evaporated. Claire didn't push that night. She didn't demand an explanation or take my silence personally. She simply showed up at my door around 9 in the evening with a bag of takeout Chinese food, Anna's favorite, though she had no way of knowing that, and sat with me on the porch steps in comfortable silence, not asking me to talk, not asking me to feel better, simply being present in the specific quiet way that only someone who understands grief from the inside can be present. We sat there for over an hour without speaking more than a few words, and at some point, I found myself telling her everything about that day, the diagnosis, the specific words the doctor used, the way Anna had squeezed my hand in the parking lot afterward and told me not to fall apart because she needed me to be strong for both of us. Claire listened, and cried a little with me, and when I finally finished, she said something I will never forget. She said that the fact I could still feel that pain so deeply, 3 years later, wasn't a sign that I was broken or stuck. It was proof of how deeply I had loved, and that kind of capacity for love didn't diminish when it found a second home, it simply grew larger to hold more. That night marked a turning point, not because the grief disappeared, but because I finally understood that it didn't need to disappear for me to move forward. I stopped seeing my feelings for Claire as some kind of betrayal of Anna and started seeing them as evidence that the love Anna and I built together had shaped me into someone still capable of loving deeply, someone Anna herself, I began to believe, would have wanted to see happy again rather than trapped forever in mourning. If any part of this story is resonating with you tonight, if you've ever felt guilty for wanting to be happy again after loss, if you believe that grief and love can occupy the same heart at the same time, I want you to take a moment right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what this story means to you. It genuinely means more than you know to hear from you. By late summer, the relationship between Claire and me had settled into something steady, something real, no longer fragile in the way new things often are. We still hadn't found me a house, not because nothing suited me, but because some part of both of us, I think, understood that whatever house I eventually chose would need to be chosen with a future in mind, a future that now, quietly and without either of us fully planning it, seemed to include her. It was Ethan, of all people, who finally pushed the conversation forward. One evening in September, after months of watching me help with homework and fix broken bicycle chains and show up consistently at family dinners without ever forcing my presence, he pulled me aside while his mother was in the kitchen and asked, bluntly, in the particular unfiltered way teenagers sometimes manage to cut straight to the heart of things adults dance around, whether I was planning on sticking around or whether he needed to brace himself for another person leaving. The question hit me harder than I expected, and I understood in that moment the full weight of what he'd already lost through his parents' divorce, the fear underneath his earlier suspicion of me. I told him, as honestly as I could, that I intended to stick around for as long as his mother would have me, and that if that meant showing up at every soccer game and helping with every college application and being there on every hard day for years to come, then that was exactly what I intended to do. That conversation, more than any romantic gesture I could have planned, was what finally made me certain about what I wanted. Not just with Claire, but with the whole shape of the life she and Ethan represented, a life that had room in it for both grief and joy, for Anna's memory and a genuine future, for a blended, imperfect, real family built out of loss and second chances. In October, almost exactly a year after we first met in the driveway of that split-level house that never worked out, Claire and I finally found the house. It wasn't the Craftsman on Birchwood Lane, which had sold to another family months earlier while I was still tangled up in my own fear. It was a smaller place on a quiet street called Willow Court, with a modest front porch and a backyard big enough for the garden Claire had mentioned wanting to plant, and a spare bedroom that Ethan had already, tentatively, started calling his room on the weekends he stayed with his mother. I walked through that house with Claire on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves outside turning the particular gold color that Anna had always loved best, and standing in that kitchen, so different from the one on Birchwood Lane and yet somehow echoing that same afternoon light, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not the absence of grief, because grief, I had come to understand, doesn't work that way, doesn't simply pack up and leave once it's overstayed its welcome. It was something quieter than that, something more like peace, the understanding that I could carry Anna's memory forward into this new chapter without it costing me the ability to build something new and real and good. I asked Claire to marry me in that kitchen, 6 months later, on a spring afternoon almost exactly 2 years after the open house that started everything. I hadn't planned some elaborate proposal with hidden photographers or a crowd of friends waiting to applaud. I simply asked her, standing in the kitchen of the home we'd already been sharing for months, the ring in my pocket feeling heavier than any physical object had a right to feel, and I told her that I didn't want to spend one more day pretending this wasn't the most important thing that had happened to me since I lost Anna, that I wanted to build the rest of my life with her, openly and without fear. She said yes with tears streaming down her face, and later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed grinning in the particular way teenagers try to hide their genuine happiness, Claire and I sat together on our back porch, looking out over the garden she'd planted that spring, and I told her something I'd been carrying for months, something I finally felt ready to say out loud. I told her that I believed, as strongly as I believed anything, that Anna would have loved her, that Anna would have been the first person cheering for us if she could have seen how this all unfolded, that somewhere in all of this unlikely, painful, beautiful journey, I felt Anna's blessing rather than her absence. We were married the following autumn, in the backyard of the house on Willow Court, under a canopy Claire's sister helped us build, surrounded by the small circle of people who had watched both of us rebuild our lives out of loss. Meredith stood up during the reception and gave a toast that had every single person in tears, talking about watching her brother disappear into grief for 3 long years and then watching, slowly and against every expectation, a man come back to life. Ethan, who had grown taller and more confident over the 2 years I'd known him, stood beside me as I said my vows, close enough that I could feel, in some quiet way, that he considered himself part of what we were building too. I think about that day at the open house often, the way two strangers, simply making a passing assumption based on nothing more than the way we stood together in a kitchen full of afternoon light, somehow saw something true before either Claire or I were brave enough to see it ourselves. I think about the 2 words Claire said instead of correcting them, "Not yet," and how those 2 words carried inside them an entire future neither of us knew we were walking toward. If this story has touched something in you tonight, if you've ever been afraid to let yourself be happy again after loss, if you believe, the way I've come to believe, that grief and love can share the same heart without one destroying the other, I want to ask you, sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, to like this video, to share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and to subscribe to this channel if stories like mine mean something to you. These stories only reach the people who need them because of you. And before I go, I want to ask something small of you. If you've ever experienced your own version of a "not yet," a moment when someone or something cracked open a door you thought was sealed forever, I want you to comment the word hope below, just that single word, so I know how many of you out there are carrying your own quiet second chances, waiting for the courage to walk through the door. 3 years ago, I stood in an empty house on Maple Ridge, certain that my capacity for love had died along with my wife. Today, I stand in a kitchen full of afternoon light on Willow Court, married to a woman who once smiled at strangers and said "not yet," watching a teenage boy who has slowly become like a son to me finish his homework at the counter, feeling, for the first time in longer than I can remember, entirely, unapologetically alive. Grief did not disappear from my life. It simply learned to make room for something else beside it. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing this story, it is this: the door is never as sealed shut as your grief wants you to believe. Sometimes it just takes someone brave enough to smile and say "not yet," and a heart brave enough to finally believe them.